Welcome to South Asian Environment Dialogue. This is a program being brought on by the Climate TV channel Canada, along with the Plurals India, and we discuss the range of issues. And today we are going to discuss an issue which is at this point of time being hugely discussed and debated across the world, especially in South Asia: air pollution. We call today's program. Are cities turning into killing fields? Are cities turning into killing fields? You all know that recently the Health Effects Institute has come up with an extremely important report. I think this is the first of its kind on cities. Previously, they have come up with regions and countries, but first of its kind on cities, where they have found that Delhi is topping globally on PM 2.5 based on 2019 data. Kolkata is the second in the list from the top. And then I think Dhaka is coming around fifth place, and Karachi is slightly down the ladder. Lot of South Asian cities in that list. But at the same time, they are also coming up with another two lists. One is on health effect, and another is on the NO2, nitrogen oxide. On those lists, Asian cities are not that up. So we'll discuss all those issues. I have with me the person who has done it, Dr. Pallavi Pant. Dr. Pant, welcome you to the show. It's great to have you and kind of know from you what exactly happened behind those wonderful reports that you have brought on and kind of put everybody into kind of recognize and stand up. Dr. Pant, to start with, how bad, we call it, are the cities killing fields? So really, how bad is the situation overall in cities? I think about 7,000 cities you have assessed, and especially the South Asian cities.
Mhm. Yeah, thank you so much for having me here today. And I'm really excited to talk about the report. As you said, we've produced reports in the past that look at national level data, so what's happening, across countries in the world. And often, there we see that South Asian countries are listed as being some of the highest when it comes to PM 2.5 levels. We also have very high levels of solid fuel use for cooking and heating and other needs. So people are also getting exposed in their homes if they're using those types of fuels. And this was the our first attempt at trying to understand what's happening in cities where some of the sources can be slightly different compared to national averages. And unfortunately, when we look at the city level as well, South Asian cities sort of end up with having very high levels of PM 2.5. Not very surprising, knowing that our averages tend to be very high in general. So in cities, some of these sources can be further concentrated, which is how we see New Delhi and Kolkata and Dhaka in that list. And interestingly, when we start looking at the full 7,200 cities, that also includes some of the smaller, towns, as we would think of them, with much smaller population, not being in millions, and several towns and smaller cities in Uttar Pradesh actually have levels that are even higher than what we see for Delhi or for Kolkata and the other South Asian metropolitan or big cities. So I think this is a problem that is not just, again, in Delhi and Kolkata and Dhaka and Karachi.
Right.
It is across our cities in South Asia. And I think one concerning part in all of this is that for some of them, the levels are, leveling off. So we're not seeing big increases in them. But for some of the cities in South Asia, these numbers are continuing to go up. So we see higher PM 2.5 levels today than we saw or in 10 years ago. So that, I think, is even more concerning because more people are moving towards cities and looking for employment opportunities, a different life, and in that process, they're also getting exposed to these high levels of PM 2.5.
So basically, I should kind of qualify my earlier statement that Delhi tops the list and Kolkata is second. Yes, that's a fact, but that's within the 103 most populous cities. I should say that should be the kind of benchmark. Otherwise, it's not that among 7,000 cities, Delhi is the highest and Kolkata second highest. as Dr. Pond said, that the smaller cities are showing high pollution. I think we should kind of ratify that statement in actual benchmark. Great, you mentioned, and I think we have seen previously that India, Bangladesh, and Pakistan almost consistently occupying the first, second, and third position, maybe changing among themselves, but there. So it was quite expected that the cities from these countries should be high, isn't it?
Yeah, that's true, and also I think one of the points that is increasingly being made, and in fact it's somewhat of a coincidence that we're talking now, and in a few days we will be celebrating the Clean Air Day on September 7th, where the theme
Yes,
this year is shared air. We're all sort of sharing the air. It doesn't respect political boundaries, geographical boundaries. And if we see India, Nepal, Pakistan, Bangladesh, we have a lot of shared air. So
absolutely.
sources of air pollution are very consistent. We also see pollution from one country sort of impacting the other and vice
Right.
versa. So South Asia in general, it is a place where we have these high levels of air pollution. And, as a result, cities have high levels of air pollution. I'm sure if we looked at rural areas across the region, we would find also that, air pollution levels are high. Sources may be different between cities and rural areas, but I think the underlying issue of high pollution is consistent.
And when you are saying high pollution, you are basically meaning PM 2.5.
Yes, PM 2.5 is one of the pollutants that we are most familiar with. We also
Right.
have the biggest, or the most extensive set of evidence on the way that PM 2.5 impacts our health. There are other pollutants of interest that we care about and think about. These include nitrogen dioxide, which we
Right.
covered in the report, primarily associated with traffic, can also come from power plants and industries. And a third pollutant that we didn't cover in this report, but is increasingly important for us to think about, is ozone,
Yes,
which
you covered ozone in earlier report that I
in
was going
earlier
to ask you.
reports. So we don't have city level data for that yet. Hopefully in the next edition we will include it. But
Oh,
ozone is an important pollutant also because across South Asia, agriculture is one of the major forms of employment, subsistence, and
right.
high levels of ozone can in many cases impact crop productivity. So this is going to be a pollutant that we need to keep our eye on, but unfortunately not city level data for me to talk about
Right.
today.
Maybe next time. Maybe next time. Just loudly thinking, is there any thought process in HEI and the research team that you have been part of and have been leading, that any combined effect, say PM 2.5, NO2, ozone, a combined, because when I'm exposed to pollution, I'm exposed to all of them. Any
Exactly.
study in pipeline like that?
Yeah, this is actually a very interesting question, and not a question that we get a lot, but researchers, at HEI, we've been interested in this question, but others have been interested too. And there has been increasingly more analysis looking at the combined effect of the air pollution mixture. So it's not just PM 2.5, it's not just NO2, but it's all of them combined together. And I think we are not at a place yet where we clearly can say, this is what the combined effect of the
Right.
mixture is. But this is an active area of research and a growing area of research, I would say.
Okay, that's great. And we all expect that some combined impact will come up in future studies. Now, before you have raised already very important points, I'll be coming to that. But very quickly, when the report was out and we started covering it, there has been responses from the government. And one of
Mhm.
the response, the common response, let me tell you from the Kolkata, because Kolkata is globally second, is the kind of a big news out here. So
Mhm.
the kind of response coming from the government sector or the set of officials is that we are not that bad, and we really don't know from where they have got hold of this data. We don't rely on this data. We don't accept this kind of data.
Mhm.
What's how you respond to that? If you can take us through how you get the data, from where you get the data, what are the sampling methodologies, simply for the name person's
Yes,
understanding?
yes, absolutely. And I think that's a very important question to ask whenever we are looking at any kind of air quality data.
Right.
So as you can imagine, across the 7,000 cities, it's going to be hard for us to get ground-based monitoring data, which means, you have monitors set somewhere in the city that is collecting what the levels of air pollution are. But fortunately, over the last several years, the satellite technology has improved and expanded. So we are now able to get both at a very fine scale. So we can start to look at what's happening, in urban areas. We can look at
Right.
what's happening at a broader scale. Data that we can collect from satellites that are measuring this continuously and over time. This is
Okay.
also an important reason why we are able to go back and look at what's been changing over the last 10, 20 years.
Okay.
We take the satellite data, then we combine it with what is being collected on the ground. And, as you would know, in India, for example, over the last 10 years, the number of air quality monitoring stations has increased a lot. So we're
Right.
getting a lot more data from the ground in Kolkata, in other cities, which is combined with the satellite
Sorry to
data.
interrupt you. It means that you are also using the government data.
Yes,
So,
we combine both satellite data and ground monitoring data. And then, we use what are called chemical transport models. So essentially, these are models that can simulate what the PM 2.5 levels are. And together, these, three pieces, the models, the satellite data, and the ground monitoring data are combined to
to
produce the
get
estimates that are in the report. And I think one piece that I will add is that even within India, satellite data is now being used more extensively, very similar approach. Dr. Sagnik Dey, who's at IIT Delhi, is using
yes,
the same
Rajesh Shagnik is
approach
working on that.
um,
Yes.
to identify where the hotspots are. So it's not something we're using across the board yet, but I think there is a need for us to do this because India is a huge country. We
Right.
have, a lot of square kilometers to cover. So using these approaches can help us figure out where do we need more attention, where do we need, more ground monitoring stations, and where should we be focusing our time, our money, and our resources to try and clean up
Great.
the air.
Just one kind of follow-up query, as because this question has been raised. You mentioned
Mhm.
about the ground level monitoring. Now, there is I won't say is an official response, but unofficially, there is a kind of thought process. It might be you are using the data from US consulate, might be the only data that you are using. Are you using only US consulate data from ground or all the government data being available?
No, we don't use just the consulate data. We use other available monitoring data as well. And in fact, the CPCB website has a lot of data that is
Right.
available on PM 2.5 and other pollutants. So it is not restricted to just the consulate monitoring stations.
And the methodology you are using is consistent over all the 7,000 cities,
It's
and
consistent over all the cities.
and
Yes,
it's
yes,
definitely peer reviewed and scientifically
yes.
being kind of. So there's thank you for clearing the air, so to say, per se. You have cleared the air because it's not really a stand-up US consulate data and being extrapolated into something. So
Mhm.
that's thanks for making it clearing it. One question here, I was talking to the Kolkata's mayor and senior officials. They are asking, or kind of would like to know, that if if more information about Kolkata is required, because I have seen the report. Uh, Apart from two tables, and when I go to that interactive app, I can put Kolkata and I could find PM 2.5. I can get
Mhm.
NO2. I can get the health impact report, the both the rate and gross
Right.
kind of there. Are you kind of? It's possible to provide more data, maybe suggestions how they can improve. Is it okay with HEI?
Yes, absolutely. One of our major ideas behind putting out these reports is to make information available because we know that it is the city governments and state governments and national governments that will ultimately take action, decide what the best ways to clean up the air are. And all of the data that we use in our reports that we, mention in messages and in, other ways of communication is always publicly accessible. And we are more than happy to share it with people and let them use it. And hopefully over time, improve this data because this is, one set of data, one set of analysis. And as you pointed out, this analysis is for 2019. And since 2019, there may have been more monitoring stations in Kolkata, across the
Right.
country, in other places. So we really see this as a dynamic data set, and we would very much like for people to use it. So if the officials in Kolkata or any other cities are interested in using this information, we will gladly share it. We will also share what can be improved in those so that the future
Absolutely.
efforts can be better.
That's wonderful to hear that, because end of the day we all want the situation to improve. I think all studies
Exactly.
actually target that. Nothing to fight over
Mhm.
that. Now let come to a very related area, the sources. Uh,
Mhm.
I have seen again the sources that you have in a table mentioned about 4 or 5 cities about the
Right.
sources, but do you have the source data from other cities? For example, I come back to Delhi or Kolkata, you have the
Mhm.
source data. Kind of, can you share
Yeah,
that? What kind of sources and what is the kind of
e-
relative proportion?
exactly. No, and this is a very important question, because when we say levels are high, the immediate next question is what causes them to be high.
Exactly,
And as you can imagine, this is a relatively short report because we want people to be able to read it, not make it 400-500
exactly.
pages and cram all the information in. So the data we provided on sources was really representative of how different parts of the world can see very different contributions from
Right,
the sources that we know about and hear about. But we have more detailed data on sources. We're actually working to update our web application so that, in addition to air quality data and health impacts, hopefully in a few months' time, you can also see what the sources are that are contributing to those levels.
right,
But in the
right.
interim, before it becomes available on the public sort of data application, we are happy to share that information. And again, as you can imagine, the sources that are relatively more or less important in Kolkata, that may not necessarily be true for Delhi, that may not
Right.
necessarily be true for Mumbai. So I think on sources, we definitely need very local information. We have that for
Mhm.
several cities. We don't have it for all 70 to 100 cities yet, because that just takes longer to
That's
do.
possible.
But for some of the biggest cities in India and around the world, we have the source information available. And these are, globally consistent data sets. So there's room for improvement, but this is a good place for the first start.
Absolutely. Though I know that is difficult to say off the cuff, but still, any input you may provide on sources in Kolkata, the dominant one, as well as Delhi, because they are the toppers, so everybody want to know about them. So,
Yeah,
what are the
I
major
think,
sources?
for cities in India, some of the most important or relevant sources tend to be waste burning. So, if we have different places across our cities, we often see
Right.
those like waste burning activities happening. Traffic can be a big source, although I
So,
will
vehicular
note that
pollution.
in
You mean
uh,
vehicular pollution?
vehicular pollution, yes,
Right.
vehicular
Right.
pollution, and across Indian cities, the mix or the importance of traffic or vehicular pollution can vary a little bit.
Right.
So, the percentage contribution for cities like Bangalore is actually higher than it is for a city like Delhi. I think in Kolkata specifically, industrial air pollution is also a big contributor.
Okay.
And then there are always, going to be some regional sources at certain times of the year. So in winter months, or just before winter months, we have the crop burning activities, which essentially are producing pollution in one place, but then
Mhm.
that pollution is getting transported over long distances,
Right.
and it can impact air quality in Delhi, it can impact air quality in Allahabad, it can impact air quality in
Right.
Patna
Right.
and in Kolkata. So there's a mix of sources that are very local, that are contributing right here, right now. And then there are sources that are, broader. So even power plants, they tend
Mhm.
not to be inside major cities in most cases. But when you have power plants and they're emitting air pollution, that will impact,
The
large
nearby cities.
areas around the place. Brick kilns tend to be a pretty big source as well. They're very
Right.
seasonal. They don't operate year round, but when they are in operation, they make a big contribution to PM
Right.
2.5 levels
Right.
also.
Okay. So, and construction, you find construction also.
Construction is another big component. And for construction, we can think of two different ways in which it can contribute. So there's the dust that is
Huh.
being, produced or resuspended when there is construction activity happening. But we also use different types of off-road equipment, which often runs on diesel, can be more polluting. So in areas with high construction activity, we can also see very localized high levels of pollution because of that machinery that is being used
Okay. Okay.
in the different processes.
Okay. And what about Dhaka? Dhaka and Karachi, because these are very important South Asian cities, and Dhaka
Mhm.
is also Bangladesh is also developing economically a lot. So many feel that
Right.
that development in economy has a bit of a negative effect on air pollution. So what's your take on that?
Yeah, so I would say that the sources of air pollution are pretty consistent and similar across South Asian cities. So
Okay. Okay.
vehicular pollution, waste burning, to some extent industrial activities. Brick kilns are a huge
Right.
source
Right.
in Pakistan, Nepal, and Bangladesh as well, not
Ah.
just India. And it is true that, as cities expand and develop, we are going to see emissions, which means, perhaps poor air quality, but we really hope that the lessons that we can learn from things that have happened in other countries, especially in, what's happened in the US, what's happened in the UK, in other European countries, is that over time we are going to see this rise. So what can we do today to implement policies that will help mitigate it before it gets too bad?
Okay.
Because we are already in a, not that great of a situation. So there have been some policies that have been introduced in different places in India. We saw, we leapfrogged from Bharat stage 4 to 6.
I
Over the
see.
next few years, we will see results from that. So we didn't, wait for another 10 years to do 4, then 5, then 6. We said, okay, let's go to 6, and that will
Right.
bring dividends over time. In Pakistan, in many places, there has been a very strong push to convert brick kilns to different technologies. So you reduce emissions, and that is useful for air quality, but that's also really useful for climate,
Mhm.
from the climate perspective. In Dhaka also there is an increasing push towards electric vehicles, or
Right.
trying to think of, how do people still move but we reduce our emissions. Nepal, not didn't feature Kathmandu didn't feature in the top cities here, but has pretty high levels of air pollution as well. So I think all of these major cities and across these countries, very similar solutions are being thought about. Um, and there is some consistency in how the different contributions are making and playing a role. Waste
In the
stands
overall,
out, brick
that's
kilns stand
that's a
out.
very important and interesting point, that the similarity within the cities. Before I just kind of come to that, another very important point you mentioned in the beginning about the air shade. So,
Hmm.
for example, Kolkata and Dhaka is perhaps, or the Bangladesh part of Bangladesh, and West Bengal in India, which is almost
Hmm.
kind of adjoining, sharing the same airshed. Also, the northern part of India and Pakistan sharing
Right.
some kind of common airshed. And often, you know that story when they tend to kind of calculate the number of tigers in West
Hmm.
Bengal, they're saying all tigers have gone to Bangladesh. And when Bangladesh calculate, they said all have gone to West Bengal. It's like airshed.
Yeah.
Indian scientists, or I'd say the Indian administrators, are saying that the Dhaka from the air from the polluted air from Bangladesh is affecting us. And Bangladesh also do the same thing. So what
Right.
about this transboundary movement of air pollution? What's your take on that?
Yeah, transboundary air pollution is actually an important, part of all of this. And I think in the last 4 or 5 years, we've seen more conversation about it, both within countries. So in case of Delhi, I think, this has played out really well and in public, where during the crop burning season, which will be upon us in a few weeks,
Mhm.
um, there is this constant back and forth about whether which state should be responsible for trying to control it. And it's essentially transboundary air pollution at a smaller scale, where we're all within the same country, but we're trying to figure out who has the responsibility, who gets the blame. And then if
Right.
you go at a slightly larger scale, the same thing happening across the Indo-Gangetic plains and the larger
Right.
region, going all the way from Pakistan to Bangladesh. The air is very similar, and we are definitely seeing impacts of air pollution sources in one country affecting the air
Affecting
quality
the
in the
other.
other.
And in fact, you just mentioned that air is similar. Uh, I don't. I'm not asking you to get into the politics, but in South Asia, the geopolitics plays a very important role. And as
Correct.
a scientist, do you feel that the country like India, Pakistan, and Bangladesh, or for that matter, Nepal as well, should have a kind of a regional air pollution combat policy? There should be some kind of a structure, institutional structure to combat. You do agree that this is required?
Yeah, I think something like that would be excellent if we can get to it. And from other parts of the world, we have examples of where, any neighboring countries, there tends to be geopolitical tension. I think it comes with how, countries function, but trying to think about what's the common good and thinking of regional action, which can also help combine resources. We are all, when we look at any of the South
Right.
Asian countries, the problems are similar. So if the solutions can be similar and we can, scale without having to spend the same amount of money in every single country, reach the same conclusion, then try to do the same thing, I think we can make progress faster. In fact, ISIMOD, which is based, I think they're headquartered in Kathmandu, have been trying to do some of this. They're trying
Mhm.
to, they've been trying to have these conversations about two Punjabs in India and Pakistan and how air pollution is the same thing. And UN agencies have also been thinking about more regional cooperative air pollution agreements. So we'll have to see how that plays out. But overall, I think across South Asia,
That
both
thinking,
for the scientists to come together and think of what
right.
evidence can be generated collectively, and for hopefully for administrators and policymakers to think about joint action would be
I think
beneficial.
absolutely important. One particular thing that when we look at the list of most polluting cities, the South Asian cities are kind of, as we discussed, leading the list. But when we are coming to the both in number of gross death as well
Mhm.
as kind of the things like rate of death and like that, we find that Beijing and Shanghai, they're still leading the list. So why this disparity within the data, pollution data and the death data, mortality data?
Yeah, thank you so much for this question because I feel like, we don't get to explore this in a lot of detail a lot of times. So when we are looking at the health impacts of air pollution, one, big sort of consideration or component in that is what you're getting exposed to, which plays a role. But the other really critical piece in that is, what does the population look like in any country or in any city? How many young people do we have? How many older people do we have?
Right.
Because as you can imagine, we are getting exposed to air pollution for long periods, years and years. And
Absolutely.
some of the diseases that contribute to the disease burden, like COPD, chronic obstructive pulmonary disease, it takes several years to develop and manifest. So when we look at how air pollution impacts are seen in populations, we see in some countries really big impacts in early childhood stages when you're born within the first 5 years. And then we see that the biggest impacts are happening in people older than 65 years of age.
Right.
So one major reason that we see this difference between highest exposures and the largest like death rates is what the demographic
Okay.
mix of the
So the
population
demographic
is.
constitution plays a role. Another question, again, I'm turning out to be the devil's advocate, that the people in the cities are saying, when you are saying, for example, the death, the gross number of death, I was
Mhm,
calculating the number of death in major Asian cities. I find
mhm,
that Delhi, within the most populous one, I found that Delhi with about 2.45 uh, kind of lakh, that is 0.25 million in last 10 years, topped the list. Then I think Shanghai comes again, and then uh, Kolkata is in fourth position, Beijing in between. So two Indian cities in between two Chinese cities. So very interesting. On the border, we are kind of not really that friend, but when it comes to being affected by air pollution, we are very good friends in a way. So that's a
yeah.
different story. So my question is that when I saw that in the report you have mentioned about I think about 4 to 6 diseases which you actually add up from the global burden of diseases to get the figure. If I
Mhm.
am I right? what I could understand from the report.
Yes.
Now, there's a question: how could you ascribe all ischemic heart attacks with PM 2.5? Is that
Mhm.
there are so many other sources, other factors?
Correct.
So that's the
Yeah.
question being raised. How you respond to that?
Yeah, that is another really good question. You're bringing really good questions, I have to
Thank
say.
you.
It is true that any of the diseases that we're looking at that we know are impacted by air pollution also have other risk factors that can influence them. So when we normally do these types of estimations, we are trying to make sure that we are apportioning the deaths. So if there are 100 deaths because of heart disease, we are using very structured methods to make
Okay.
sure that you're taking into account like blood pressure, for example, or what people's diets might
Right.
be, whether they have higher risk of certain diseases or not. And then the analysis takes that into account. In fact, the underlying data set that is used, global burden of disease, which we've also used for our national level analysis, tries to do that in a comprehensive, like structured way. So you're
Right.
looking at a whole range of risk factors. They look at about 87 risk factors, and then they
Okay.
try to say across all of them, which diseases are most strongly related to which risk factor. So for
Okay.
cardiovascular disease, it will be a list. Then if you look at traffic injuries, you're only going to get traffic injuries from certain risk factors. So they
Right.
try to pair those up. For air pollution, there are about 6 diseases that we know we have very strong evidence for, consistent across the globe. Wherever we have done research, we've seen that sort of link between the two. So we use those. And in over the last several cycles, and hopefully in future we can continue this, we are continuing to see which other diseases or which other
Okay.
types of ailments are strongly connected with air pollution. In the last few years, we added diabetes to the list. It wasn't there
Right.
from the start. The
Type
last
2, type 2 diabetes. Type 2
Type 2
diabetes.
diabetes, yes, type 2 diabetes. And we added infant health, which we know is impacted by air pollution.
Okay.
In future, we are looking at some of the other diseases, one of them being the neurodegenerative
Right.
diseases like dementia, which have been linked with air pollution. They have been identified as air pollution has been identified as a risk factor. There's a growing evidence base. So I think it's, again, it's
So
all
as the science
science
as the science goes on,
as the
so I'm
science progresses.
just trying to understand it a bit clearly. So what do you mean that when you are finding the connection of air pollution with a particular disease, then as
Mhm.
per the study, within that overall number, you are taking certain proportion as per the risk factor and the exposure factor, and you are taking that data. So you are not taking the entire gamut of it, you are taking part of it based on your study. Am I right?
Yeah, that's correct. And in fact, I don't have these numbers for city levels, but at the national level, when we
Right.
report the impact on some of the major non-communicable diseases, we are able to say that, for example, 30% of all lung cancer deaths are linked with air pollution. The other 70% are linked to a whole other set of
Okay.
risk factors. So we try to give that indication of what percentage of any disease is being impacted by air pollution. And in fact, when we start looking at those trends for around the world, some
Mhm.
countries we see higher proportion of diabetes that's linked to air pollution. In some places we see more heart or stroke that's linked to air
Right.
pollution.
Right.
So that's how those data get used.
So basically, you are working with the secondary data and kind of analyze that to come to your conclusion, whatever you're trying to do. Great. I think absolutely great, Dr. Pant. I think the way you explained it. I have very quickly 2 questions before we wind up this session. One is that when you go to the NO2 list, the nitrogen oxide list, it's very different from the PM 2.5. It looks
Yes.
different world. It looks like a developed country cities disease. Now, first question is why is this? And second is, do the countries like Kolkata, Delhi, Dhaka, and Karachi need to learn from it?
Yeah, I think, this has also been one of the things that we are really trying to draw attention to, that when we when we normally think of air pollution, always South Asian cities come to the top of your mind, or like China comes to the
Right.
top of your
Right.
mind. But when we look at NO2, which is first, it's a gaseous pollutant. And one of the major sources for NO2 in urban areas, especially, is vehicles. We know that, in urban areas, a majority of NO2 we're going to see will be coming from vehicles. So if you look at the list of cities that are on the top for nitrogen dioxide, as you said, they tend to be in high income countries, major like big
Right.
cities. And these are also places where transport or, vehicular air pollution is a big contributor. So they have this huge like NO2 concentration, or NO2 exposures are very high, but they may not have some of the other sources that we see in, South Asian cities. For
Exactly.
example, waste burning may not be such a big issue. We may not have things like brick kilns, which means that the pattern of exposure and the contribution of the source, which is primarily linked with NO2 in urban areas, vehicles, is leading that trend. Some cities that are on the list of NO2 are also those where we have a lot of older diesel vehicles,
Okay.
especially in some of the southern or southeastern European countries, I should say, or Central European countries. The vehicle fleet tends to include a lot of older diesel vehicles that have been, shipped there because they were in use somewhere else. Now they're
Right.
old. So they will be more polluting, or they will emit higher levels of NO2 and other pollutants. So that is another reason why there is a bit of that mix. And I think for Indian cities or for South Asian cities, the
Right.
lesson there is to make sure, as vehicle ownership in our South Asian cities is rising very rapidly.
Very
And
sharp.
although the vehicles are cleaner in general, they're using more advanced technology now, and a number of measures to reduce what comes out of the tailpipe of the vehicle. We need to continue to focus on expanding public transportation options and promoting active modes of transport, cycling, walking, and that wouldn't happen necessarily in isolation. So these are things that we need to think how cities are expanding, and do people have green space? Do people
Right.
have the place to walk? So the lesson for us would be to hopefully not get to that stage. The worrying thing is that NO2 levels, although we're not in the top 20s here, but when we look at mega cities around the world, these are, some of the cities with the largest population worldwide. Um, Mumbai and Bengaluru are in that list of like on the top. So we do have a problem that is perhaps growing, but we still have time to try and figure out how are we going to fix it? What are the ways in which we can try and control that pollution today and in the next several years so it doesn't get as bad?
Very interesting. And before going to my final question, just a supplementary one to what you just mentioned. So, hearing you, it seems that the vehicles may not be the topper in the South Asian cities in terms of PM 2.5, but if you consider the kind of overall impact, vehicles are contributing both at PM 2.5 and NO2, if I understand it properly. So, do you consider vehicle as the overall major source, and a plan the city should plan more kind of properly about it?
Yeah, so I wouldn't say that vehicles are contributing more to PM 2.5 than NO2. I think, they contribute to both.
Okay.
The thing to keep in mind for South Asian cities in particular is that in general, the age of vehicles is younger, because a lot of people
Right.
have been buying cars in the last 10 years. So our fleet, and not necessarily by design, but by coincidence, is younger, it's newer cars. But for cities to be thinking of nitrogen dioxide pollution in particular, the vehicular transportation will be an important source to think about. But it shouldn't, be the case that we just focus all the energy on vehicles and then ignore the other major
Right.
sources we
So
also
it's a
have to address.
multi-sectoral. It's a multi-sectoral,
Multi-sectoral, absolutely.
the multi-sectoral effort. Thank you. That upon my final question. Uh, I think 5 or 7 years down the line, people and scientists also didn't think that air pollution and climate change are linked in a way or not. But I think I have been covering COPs for last 10, 12 years, and I find now air pollution in the climate COP is being discussed at a much greater length, much wider kind of spectrum. Now, the climate change, as you know, with the Air 6 report and everything, and we should start acting right now. How you see the marriage of air pollution and climate change and combined strategy, if anything is there to come up in future?
No, I think, we do need to be thinking more about combined strategies to address air pollution and climate. And I think one very good example of that we've seen happen in different parts of the world in the last like few months when it's been summer in many places, and we've seen heat waves happen
Right,
in
right,
many cities around the world. And almost consistently in every place that has had a heat wave, we have seen higher levels of ozone, because that's, summer is when we see the highest levels of ozone. We can, save why that happens for another conversation, but this has been a very direct, like an example right here in front of us. There's also growing research about how higher temperatures and high levels of air pollution could, impact people's health even more. So again, thinking about those, mixtures of different exposures that are going to happen, and if we start to think about ways to address air pollution and ways to address climate, I think there are already some similarities. So the sources we are
right.
looking at, trying to phase out, the more polluting sources of energy, trying to move towards renewables, thinking also about expanding energy access to households that may be using, wood or coal for consumption at the household level, and ultimately, thinking of how either whichever sort of mitigation strategy we are trying to think of, how does that improve people's health? That's one really big, way to connect air pollution and climate action together.
I think absolutely fascinating. I think we can keep on discussing, and it was so wonderful the way you have kind of discussed and kind of pointed out the main issues regarding this report, and also going beyond that. And really, really, I feel that the city level officials across the world, particularly South Asian countries, should engage more deeply with the research institute like yours and take input and try to improve up in the scenario to a large extent. Thank you, Dr. Pond. It's such a pleasure and privilege to have your time and discuss this. I think an extremely important agenda. You have really made air clearer, literally air clearer. Lot of fumes being going around, a lot of kind of smogs being going around about this report. I think you have tried your best and to clean up the air as far as possible. I hope these messages will reach the people where it should have been, and we'll keep on discussing. I think it's such a privilege to kind of discuss with you, and I will keep on discussing. Thank you for your time. We conclude today.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank
Yes, thank you so very much.
you. Thank you.